What if your city looked at the electric company and basically said, you know what? I don't think we need you anymore. We can handle our own power, our own grid, our own infrastructure, right? This is actually the conversation happening right now in Ann Arbor, Michigan. After more than a century of receiving electricity from DTE Energy, residents could be taking one of the biggest steps yet toward creating their own controlled electric utility. And depending on who you listen to, this could either be one of the smartest infrastructure decisions Ann Arbor has ever made, or an extraordinarily expensive experiment that could ultimately cost hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially approaching $1 billion or more. And so that's why I think this story is much bigger than Ann Arbor, DTE, right? Because we're really talking about something most people almost never think about. Who should own the infrastructure underneath a city? Should electricity be treated primarily as a regulated business, or should something this essential be controlled locally, right? Almost like water, sewer infrastructure, streets, or public lighting. And here's where this gets especially interesting for me as a real estate developer. Electricity isn't some abstract policy decision. When we're talking about developing a building, electricity affects everything: construction, transformer availability, utility connections, operating expenses, tenant costs, restaurant equipment, heating and cooling, elevators, lighting, and increasingly EV chargers, solar panels, battery storage, heat pumps, and potentially even the ability to attract major businesses. So when a city starts talking about taking control of its electrical infrastructure, developers should absolutely be paying attention. But before everybody starts yelling, forget DTE, let Ann Arbor run the grid, there's another side to this conversation, because buying an electrical system is not like buying a vacant building from the land bank. You aren't just buying some poles and wires. You're potentially acquiring hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure, taking on debt, building an entirely new organization, hiring utility professionals, maintaining substations, right? Responding to storms, negotiating power purchases, setting rates, and assuming responsibility when somebody's electricity goes out at 2 o'clock in the morning. So let's check this video out, because Ann Arbor might be attempting something that could eventually become a blueprint for other Michigan communities.
For over 100 years, DTE has supplied power to the city of Ann Arbor, but in recent years, there have been growing calls from residents to abandon the utility company and instead start their own.
People sometimes talk about utilities as if the cities naturally chose their existing providers yesterday, right? That's not how American infrastructure developed. A lot of these relationships go back generations, right? Electric utilities spent decades constructing enormous interconnected systems of generating plants, transmission lines, substations, transformers, distribution lines, and service connections. And once that infrastructure exists, you essentially have what economists call a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly occurs when it doesn't make economic sense to have five competing companies build five separate sets of infrastructure. Imagine five electric companies, each installing their own poles down your street, right? Five sets of wires, five transmitters, five crews digging up the road. That would be ridiculous. So instead, one company typically operates the distribution network within a defined service territory, while government regulates things like rates and service requirements. That's fundamentally different from something like a restaurant, right? If you don't like one restaurant, you go across the street. If you don't like your electric company, you generally can't say, I'm switching electric companies tomorrow. That's why utility regulation matters so much.
So in the 6 years you've been an organization, is this probably the biggest step that you've reached so far?
Yeah, no, this is huge.
Sean Higgins is president of Ann Arbor for Public Power, a group which has been gathering the 5,000 signatures needed for a ballot proposal to oust DTE from Ann Arbor and create a city-owned power utility, an effort driven by growing frustrations with rising costs, frequent outages, and the company's reliance on fossil fuels.
There are a number of arguments happening, and so I think it's important not to lump them all together when it comes to this issue and how monumental it could be depending on which way the community sways, right? So there is the cost argument, there's the reliability argument, and then there's the environmental argument. You could potentially improve one without improving the others, right? For an example, you could build an extremely reliable electrical system that's expensive. You could build a relatively inexpensive system that still relies heavily on fossil fuels, or you could aggressively pursue renewable generation and discover that you still need major investments in distribution, infrastructure, and storage, right? That's why I would want voters to ask, What problem are we actually trying to solve? Because we don't like DTE is not necessarily an infrastructure strategy, but being frustrated with your utility is most definitely understandable, right? Now, with that said, your municipality taking over the infrastructure of an electric company isn't necessarily punishment. That's an acquisition, right? You're essentially saying we believe we can own, finance, and operate this infrastructure better ourselves. That's a dramatically higher standard. Now, let's talk about reliability. Michigan residents have legitimate reasons for making reliability part of this discussion. The 2023 ice storms left hundreds of thousands of Michigan customers without electricity, creating enormous political pressure around utility reliability. And if you're watching this from Detroit, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Storms come through, lights flicker, you grab your phone, open the outage map, and then you see estimated restoration sometime between tomorrow and the second coming, right? So let me just be clear. Like at the end of the day, we as customers do find ourselves frustrated more than we need to be frustrated with the current servicing of our electrical grid. There's a huge economic impact here that doesn't always show up on your electric bill, right? When electricity goes down, restaurants lose inventory, businesses lose operating hours, remote workers can't work, apartment residents lose heating or cooling. I had a power outage at an apartment complex of mine right before July 4th, and it was one of the hottest weekends of the year, right? And our power was out for 4 days roughly. And so that is tenants that didn't have air, didn't have power to the elevator, right? We have some senior tenants that weren't able to get up and down as easy as they like, right? All of these different challenges when the power goes out. Basements can flood if sump pumps stop operating, right? Security systems can go offline. Traffic signals stop operating. That's why infrastructure reliability is actually part of economic development policy.
This is just a utility that, in so many ways, is not aligned with the values of the city of Ann Arbor.
Shout out to Sean Higgins for the movement that he was able to put in place. At the end of the day, getting this on the ballot and getting it to a point where residents can vote on this issue is major, major. So shout out to you and your movement. Thanks to you, the residents of Ann Arbor have the opportunity to say if this is the right move for them or not. This is where the conversation gets politically fascinating, because what does it mean for utility to reflect the values of a city? Historically, utilities were evaluated mostly around three questions, right? Can you provide electricity? Can you provide reliability with regard to the electricity that you're providing? And can you provide it affordably? Today, cities increasingly want utilities to accomplish additional objectives: decarbonization, distributed solar, battery storage, electrification, climate resilience, EV charging, energy efficiency, environmental justice, and local economic development. Ann Arbor actually has one of the most aggressive sustainability goals in Michigan. The city has targeted community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030. So from Ann Arbor's perspective, control over energy infrastructure can become part of accomplishing a broader municipal strategy. But here's my challenge to that argument. Values are important, but engineering is undefeated. You can have the greenest mission statement in America, but when it's 12 degrees outside, residents aren't asking whether the utility's mission statement aligns with their values. They're asking, are my lights on? Does my heat still work, right? So any municipal utility has to deliver both climate objectives and reliability. Now, there's another piece of context here. Ann Arbor voters already approved creation of something called the Sustainable Energy Utility, right? That's not the same thing as replacing DTE. The Sustainable Energy Utility is voluntary and supplemental. Participating customers remain connected to the traditional electric grid, while the municipal utility can provide such things as local solar and battery storage solutions. Those are dramatically different levels of responsibility. Putting solar panels and batteries on participating properties, that's one thing. Taking responsibility for an entire urban distribution grid, Whole different ball game.
Roughly 40 municipalities in Michigan run their own power, but all were established at least a century ago. The American Public Power Association estimates public power customers pay 14% less on their bills and have 4.5 fewer hours without power during major events.
This is where supporters of municipal power have a legitimately compelling argument. Public power isn't some theoretical socialist electricity experiment that nobody has ever tried. Municipally owned utilities exist throughout the United States, and some operate extremely well. We actually have examples here in Michigan. Holland, Michigan, right? Holland operates its own electric utility through the Holland Board of Public Works. Holland BPW says its electric rates are approximately 45% below investor-owned utilities and describes its reliability among the strongest in Michigan. Now, with that said, that doesn't prove Ann Arbor would automatically reproduce Holland's results, but it does prove something extremely important. Municipal electricity can work, but there's a massive catch, right? The news story briefly mentions it, but most Michigan municipal systems are very, very old, right? They were created when America's electrical infrastructure was still being built. So that means communities like Holland didn't necessarily have to purchase a mature modern distribution system from a giant incumbent utility at today's replacement value. And that distinction matters enormously.
A public utility has so much potential in terms of benefits to the people.
Higgins says the yes or no vote would establish a governing board, which would first explore the potential for city-run power. But City Councilwoman Erica Briggs argues it's more than that.
I think there's a lot of confusion about what it is and what's on the ballot and how it's being billed, is that it's not a big deal. The reality is it's a huge deal.
I definitely agree with that statement, not necessarily as an argument against the municipality taking over the electrical grid, but as an argument for taking municipalization seriously, right? This is not, should Ann Arbor build another bike lane? Should Ann Arbor approve a zoning change? Should Ann Arbor renovate a park? We're potentially talking about ownership of one of the fundamental structure systems supporting the entire system. Homes, apartments, utility facilities, retail, restaurants, hospitals, labs, office buildings, industrial properties, data infrastructure, everything, right? And that's where I started thinking like a developer. Imagine I'm developing a 100-unit affordable housing complex, and the project has already spent millions on architecture, engineering, financing, and construction. Then I'm told, hey, I don't think we have enough transformer capacity to service your building. That can delay the project, and every month of delays costs money. Construction loan interest continues, insurance continues, general conditions continue, investor returns get delayed, lease up gets delayed. So when Ann Arbor considers controlling its grid, developers should ask, right? Could municipal ownership make infrastructure coordination faster, right? Could developers communicate directly with the local utility, which would be a win-win? Can Ann Arbor proactively build capacity in redevelopment districts? Could electric infrastructure become part of economic development planning? Those are potentially enormous advantages from a developer standpoint. But the opposite could happen too. If the new utility is understaffed, underfunded, politically micromanaged, or slow to approve infrastructure upgrades, developers could face a completely different bureaucracy. Public ownership does not automatically equate to competent management, and that's the distinction I would like to keep emphasizing here.
Briggs says the study would cost more than $1 million, and if the city moves forward, it could face years of legal battles and about $1 billion to buy DTE's Ann Arbor assets.
In sort of the short term, we would take out this large bond for the acquisition. It would be paid out over time through rates, not taxes.
There is no funding associated with this. So that means we're going to need to either cut services to move forward, or we're going to have to put a millage in front of voters.
In a statement, a DTE spokesperson said in part, quote, "The proposal to take over Ann Arbor's electric grid will cost the city of Ann Arbor nearly $1 billion on day one, leading to skyrocketing costs for Ann Arbor businesses and residents."
I'm going to do what most of us have been taught in this city to do, which is do our research, and research.
In Ann Arbor, I'm Brett Cast, 7 News, Detroit.
Okay, so here's the number that everybody's going to remember, right? $1 billion. But I want viewers to be careful with that number. The city's municipalization FAQ says the 2023 study estimated acquiring DTE's Ann Arbor distribution assets, excluding their substations. They're estimating that that price would be anywhere from $281 million to $1.15 billion. And the city notes that those estimates don't account for subsequent investment or inflation, right? That's not a small range. That's $281 million to more than 4 times that amount. Utility valuation gets complicated, right? You're not just counting poles. You need to identify distribution lines, transformers, meters, substations, rights of way, equipment, control systems, land, customer infrastructure, shared systems, and potentially stranded costs, right? Stranded costs are expenses or investments an incumbent utility may argue it should recover even if customers leave the existing system. Then you have another massive question, right? What is the infrastructure actually worth? Is it worth depreciated book value, replacement cost, market value, future earning potential, some negotiated number, right? That disagreement alone can produce litigation. Now, here's something I think viewers should understand, right? When people hear the city could borrow $1 billion, they understandably think my property taxes are about to explode, but that's not necessarily how utility financing works. Theoretically speaking, Ann Arbor could borrow hundreds of millions of dollars, buy the electric infrastructure, and then repay those bonds over decades using electric rates paid by customers. Now, whether you call something a tax or a utility rate, the household still pays it, right? The money doesn't become imaginary because it moved to another line item. So the real question isn't, will taxes increase? The better question is, what will the total cost of electricity be after debt service, operations, maintenance, purchased power, right? Staffing and future capital improvements. That's the number voters need, because imagine municipalization reduces operating costs by $30 million annually, but adds $45 million annually in acquisition debt, right? You haven't necessarily saved customers money. Conversely, if Ann Arbor can operate efficiently, purchase electricity competitively, and spread acquisition debt over a long period, the economics could potentially work. That's why acquisition price matters so much. Now, another question that the residents should be asking themselves is, what exactly would Ann Arbor be buying, right? This is another place where I think people misunderstand utilities. Ann Arbor doesn't necessarily need to own a giant power plant. Municipal utilities can purchase wholesale electricity. A city can actually own the distribution system, the infrastructure delivering electricity through the community, right? While buying electricity generated elsewhere. Winter Park, Florida provides a fascinating example. Residents voted in 2003 to purchase their electric distribution system after reliability complaints, and municipal operations began in 2005. Winter Park doesn't generate all its own electricity. It purchases power through outside arrangements. But local ownership allowed the city to pursue aggressive undergrounding of its electrical infrastructure. And 2 decades later, the American Public Power Association reported Winter Park's average 2023 electric rates were about 24% lower than DTE Energy Florida's, while the city had invested roughly $65 million in undergrounding. Now, that doesn't mean Winter Park did it, therefore Ann Arbor should. Different city, different utility, different acquisition price, different state regulatory environment, right? Different climate, different grid. But it's evidence that municipalization can provide tangible long-term infrastructure changes when executed well. Now, let's talk about the other side for a bit, right? Boulder, Colorado spent years pursuing municipalization from Xcel Energy after voters authorized exploration in 2011. Legal disputes, regulatory proceedings, separation planning, and negotiations dragged on for years, and ultimately Boulder reached a settlement and abandoned the immediate municipalization effort rather than completing the takeover. And that's one of the examples Ann Arbor supporters should study just as closely as successful municipal utilities, because here's the uncomfortable reality. You can be philosophically right and financially wrong. You can believe local ownership is better. You can believe renewable energy is better. You can believe your existing utility needs improvement and still conclude the acquisition price makes this deal financially irresponsible. With all of that said, obviously DTE has an economic interest here, right? Let's acknowledge that Ann Arbor represents customers and infrastructure within DTE's service territory. DTE does not want to lose those customers. That's completely rational, but supporters of municipalization also have a point of view and assumptions about future savings. So I wouldn't automatically accept either side's headline number. If I'm an Ann Arbor voter, I want to see the acquisition price. I want to see the financing structure, interest rate assumptions, debt service coverage, purchased power assumptions, staffing costs, capital improvement requirements, storm response costs, insurance, legal expenses, future renewable investments, customer rates, commercial rates, industrial rates, a sensitivity analysis, right? Showing what happens if assumptions are wrong. But let me be clear here. DTE doesn't simply get to say municipalization is expensive, because staying with the existing system isn't free either, right? In January 2025, Michigan regulators approved approximately $217 million in additional annual electric revenue for DTE, increasing the bill of a typical residential customer using 500 kilowatt hours per month by roughly 4.65%. And rate cases continue to be a major issue here in Michigan. So Ann Arbor voters need to compare, right, cost of municipalization against the long-term cost of not doing so. That's the analysis that matters. If DTE continues investing heavily in grid modernization, reliability improves, renewable generation increases, and rates remain competitive, the city taking over the power grid could look unnecessary. But if customers continue experiencing dissatisfaction with rates and reliability, then local ownership becomes more politically attractive. The city of Ann Arbor also presents a fascinating physical challenge. This is a tree town. Beautiful, mature neighborhoods. I love tree-lined neighborhood streets. That's my favorite thing about neighborhoods. Large trees, older infrastructure, overhead electrical lines, and those things don't always peacefully coexist. A major 2026 controversy in Ann Arbor involved DTE's aggressive tree trimming as part of its reliability efforts. DTE argued that the trimming was necessary to reduce outages, while residents complained about damage to the city's beloved tree canopy. And this exposes the trade-off perfectly, right? Residents say, stop cutting our trees. Utility says, branches are hitting electrical lines. Then residents say, then underground the lines. Utility says, that's extraordinarily expensive. And suddenly you've arrived at the actual infrastructure question. Who pays? But forget about electricity for a second. Think about things like water, sewer, roads, transit, broadband, streetlights, right? Infrastructure determines how cities function, and whoever controls infrastructure has enormous influence over development. That's why this debate is really about local control. A municipal utility could theoretically say, we're going to prioritize undergrounding in this particular neighborhood. We're going to install grid capacity in this redevelopment district. We're going to build community solar here. We're going to invest in battery storage here. We're going to create special programs for affordable housing. We're going to coordinate utility improvements with street reconstruction, right? That integration could be extremely powerful. So I want to know what you think. If you live in Ann Arbor and you had a chance between remaining with DTE or potentially spending hundreds of millions of dollars to establish a municipally controlled electric system, how would you vote? And what number changes your answer, right? 300 million, 500 million, 750 million, $1 billion, right? Or would you say electricity is simply too important for a city to hand over to a publicly traded utility in the first place? And here's an even bigger question for my Detroit viewers. Would you ever want Detroit to explore something similar? Because if Ann Arbor moves forward, every city in Michigan is going to be watching. And if Ann Arbor succeeds, this conversation probably won't end in Ann Arbor. But if it becomes an expensive legal and financial disaster, cities around Michigan will be studying that lesson too. That's what makes this story fascinating. It's not really about one electric company. It's about something much bigger. Who should own the infrastructure that makes a modern city possible? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.